And here black can capture the queen either with the rook or with the knight. But here Fischer decides to capture this with the knight because this knight on c6 is not doing too much here. So that's why he wants to reroute this knight to e6, which will be a very strong outpost for this knight. And after that, here white brings his knight to b5, threatening to take on c7, and Fischer defends this by knight to e6. But Larsen decides to bring his knight to g5, a very good move. He wants to deflect this knight so that he can capture this pawn on c7. So that's why here Fischer goes for rook to e7, which guards this c7 pawn. But here some of you might be thinking that why Larsen didn't capture this pawn on a7 after rook to e7. This is because suppose if knight takes a7, now black can play this amazing move knight to f4. And now since this bishop on e7 is under attack, so let's suppose if he just slides his bishop to d1, bishop to d4, bishop to g4, asking for bishop exchange. And if he attacks this by f3, simply bishop to d7. And in the next move, black will go for c6 so that he can trap this knight. So that's why knight to b5. And after that, black can go for h6, which attacks this knight. And after knight goes back to h3, knight takes h3 check, g takes h3, and finally bishop takes h3. And yeah, so this rook is attacked, so that's why after rook to f2, and at the end you can see that black kingside pawn structure is compromised, as well as black has also opened this a file for his rook, and this bishop on h3 is in a very good position, and because of this black will be better. Okay, so in the actual game, after rook at f goes to d1, yeah, so that's why b6. Okay, after that, black goes for b6, which cuts this diagonal for this bishop, and in the next move, black will go for c6, which attacks this knight. And since this e4 pawn is under attack by this knight, so that's why to defend this, here white can push f3, which also strengthens the pawn structure. But instead of f3, here white can also capture this knight on c5 by bishop takes c5, because after b takes c5, this creates a double pawn structure, which can give some advantage to white in future. Okay, so after f3, Okay, so after that, here Fischer decides to attack this rook by c6. And here white cannot capture this pawn on e5. This is because suppose if rook takes c5, now black can play this amazing move rook to a4, which attacks this bishop. And here white cannot capture this bishop by pushing this move, which is b3. This is because now black can simply capture this a3 pawn by his rook, and in the next move black will bring this knight to d7, and you can see by this this rook gets trapped. Okay, so suppose after rook to a4, yeah, after rook to a4, if white decides to just bring back this bishop, then rook to d4 with the idea of rook to d2, which attacks this pawn and this bishop. And this rook on e5 is not going anywhere. And if white pushed suppose b4, he tries to attack this knight, then simply knight to d7. And you can see that in the next move black is going to capture this rook. And so some of you might be like, why black didn't play f6 in because it also traps this rook, but by this all sequence we get the better placement of this rook, which is on d4 right now. Okay, so in the actual game after c6, so that's why after seeing this all he decides to just bring back this rook to d2. And now it's better for white to bring this rook to g3 so that he can target these weak pawns. But instead, he goes for rook to c3, which is a mistake. This is because now black can go for rook to a8, attacking this bishop, and obviously you can't go for bishop to h7 because then bishop to h7 so that he can capture this pawn on g6. This is because then black will simply brings this king to f7 and white bishop get trapped. So that's why the only best square for this bishop is simply this a2 square, and now black can go for c5, attacking this pawn, and suppose if takes, now comes b4, threatening to capture this rook as well as this a3 pawn. And obviously white can't capture this pawn on b4 because then black will capture this bishop. So that's why rook to g3, and after that simply knight takes g5, and this is completely winning for white, winning for black. And okay, so after rook to c3, here Fischer missed that move, which is rook to a8, and instead he goes for c5. And now it's better for white to capture on c5 so that he can simplify the position, but instead he made a mistake by playing g4. And this is a mistake because now Fischer immediately pushed c4, and now you can see these pawns. they are in a very strong position.
Saints.
And in this position, the final move by Fischer is king takes b6, and here bent Larsen resigned. This is because suppose if game continues like king to f2, if white tries to attack this knight, then simply black can promote to queen, and after knight takes c1, knight takes c1, king to f3, king to c5, and if king to e4, he tries to capture this pawn, simply king to d6. Black can easily defend this, and if king to f5, if he tries to run through this h5 pawn, simply king to d5, king to g5, e4, and if king to f4, now black can simply bring his king to d4 so that he can promote, and if king to g3, e3, king to f3, king to d3, if king to f4, which is the only move, obviously he can't go there, and if that's why if suppose if e2, yeah, king to f3, and the final move will be even equal to queen. And yeah, that's all. Like this video and also make sure to subscribe to my channel. This is your host Bison signing off. Bye bye.